Beyond the Valley.
This week we're at Web Summit, the annual tech conference in Lisbon. The main topic of discussion here is, of course, AI. The excitement around large language models such as Microsoft's Gemini and OpenAI's ChatGPT has, however, been tempered by concerns with bias, a lack of transparency and the accuracy of results that generative AI presents. So, is there a way to de-risk the AI development process and build accurate, factual AI that we can trust?
Beyond the Valley.
Let's introduce our guest this week. Brooke Hartley Moy is co-founder and CEO of AI startup Infactory. She previously worked for Salesforce and Google. And before starting Infactory, she was head of strategic partnerships at Humane, a company that developed an AI pin, which we'll talk more about later. Brooke, thank you for joining us on Beyond the Valley.
Very happy to be here.
We're going to get into your journey, your story, and tackle what you call the bro code of AI business. But first, you wrote Once Upon a Time. With a new frontier comes the opportunity to make new rules. We don't need to adhere to the old power norms. The AI revolution gives us an opportunity to welcome a new slate of leaders. So, if we are to have a new cohort of leaders in AI, what skills, or more importantly, characteristics, do you believe they need to have?
Yeah. I've been in software longer than I care to admit. I won't put a number on it usually, but I've seen a lot of trends come and go. I've seen, the conversation of move fast and break things, the world of, if you are disrupting, that's where the praise comes from, that's where the opportunities come from. I think AI, we've never had a technology in anyone's lifetime that has this much potential to fully change every aspect of everyone else's lives. And for that reason, the people that are going to be successful harnessing its capabilities, ensuring that we have something that we are going to be proud of from an innovation perspective, not afraid of, not concerned about, need to be people that really understand the practical opportunities, have a pragmatic viewpoint, understand a diverse set of experiences and perspectives, not just a single sort of lane. And it's funny that we're on Beyond the Valley podcast, because I think about how there is sort of this bubble type thinking specifically to the Silicon Valley set around where AI can be going. And I think it's also people that ultimately want to be building AI for good. I call myself an AI optimist. I certainly believe in the power of the technology, and for that reason, I want people that see that opportunity more so than they see just dollar signs or the ability to move as quickly as possible to see what happens and hope for the best.
Before we get into it, we're going to have Arjun do Stat of the Week. You know how to play Stat of the Week, Brooke. We've already explained it to you, so let's hear it, Arjun.
Yeah, but I'm going to do it slightly differently, So I'm going to give you the start of a sentence with a stat in it, and at the end, you're going to finish that sentence for me.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a bit,
nice curveball.
Yeah.
Change up the rules.
So here we go. 94% of people in the UK have.
94%.
Have what?
Okay.
Yeah. So have a think. We'll come back to it at the end, and I'll say it again.
Fantastic. All right, Arjun, I know you want to start us off with your opening questions, Brooke.
Yeah. Well, I want to just ask a little bit, Brooke, about your backstory.
Yeah.
How did you get into this?
How did I get
Why did you get into tech?
How did I end up here? Why are we all
exactly.
here?
Yeah.
It's funny. I was a history major in college, which actually comes up nowadays more often than not. In fact, my talk this week will have a little bit of a history theme to it, because I bring sort of this sense of where are we as far as cycles and trends, and if this is the AI super cycle, what does that mean for all the trends that came before, and what can we learn from that? I ended up in tech, honestly, because it was something as going through school I always was interested in, but I thought that the only opportunities in tech were for people that were software engineers, computer scientists, which was, and still is, a very male-dominated space. It wasn't a space that I necessarily saw as welcoming or open to people that were like me or had my kind of background. So I never knew really that it was an option until actually a fellow female founder, Cass Lazaro, who's still someone that I consider a mentor and I look up to greatly, She had a startup that was focused on software applications for Facebook, of all things, which always dates me with Gen Z. And I had this opportunity to take that as my first job. She took a bet on me with no software engineering experience, no tech experience, and I was sort of hooked from then on out. The company was acquired by Salesforce. I spent a large chunk of my career there, learned the ins and outs of all things enterprise sales and software sales, and then was part of the founding team in Asia Pacific for Slack, which was very much a 0 to 1. Slack was not a mature business yet in the US, and so it was even further from a mature business in Asia Pacific, and figuring out how to build something from the ground up there, which is where a lot of my entrepreneurial interests, I think, stem from. Moved back to the US, had the opportunity to be at Google for a number of years working on Android, which is particularly ironic now because my co-founder is one of the iPhone inventors, and so I like to give him a hard time that I'm green bubble until I die, and still carry my Android device with pride. And then was recruited from Android to join the Humane team, seeing that the only thing that would take me away from Google was something that was truly a generation-defining technology, and that was AI. And that was, now a few years ago, and getting to have a front row seat to a company that was building foundation model type technology before ChatGPT was a household name, and getting to have sort of a front row seat to all those experiences, and spending a lot of time working on what are the big challenges that need to be solved in AI before the technology is going to be able to be used in a way that people really find valuable and meaningful, ultimately was what led me to what is now Infactory and what I'm focused on now. And
we'll get more into that entrepreneurial journey later, but Infactory.
Yeah.
What is it? What do you do?
Yeah.
Give us the pitch.
Yes. So the whole idea of Infactory, it's even in the name, in fact. We are focused on how do you bring accuracy, determinism, and facts to the AI space. I think at this point in the journey that we've been on with LLMs and generative AI, I think most people have a pretty good understanding that hallucinations are a feature, they're not a bug. And as much as we see the models improving, as much as we see more accuracy and more human-like qualities to the models and the technology that they're able to create, they are inherently probabilistic. And we wouldn't want to curb that. We wouldn't want to reduce that entirely, because that's partly what makes them magical, what makes them feel human-like, which allows them to be creative, when they are able to improve writing or being used, for agentic capabilities where they can be very human-like in how they complete tasks. All of that is part of what you want in a generative AI type application. But at the same time, when it comes to enterprise and for businesses where close enough is not good enough, then there needs to be some other technology, some other innovations in the space outside of LLMs that's going to close the gap between true deterministic accuracy and something that just feels a little bit off, a little bit of randomness in the system, ultimately leading to likely an erosion of trust and sort of an embrace of the technology itself. So our tech at Infactory is essentially a platform that allows anyone that is trying to build AI technology for the enterprise to apply our tech in such a way that you can get that level of accuracy. You will have citations, attribution, deterministic answers alongside the generative AI capabilities.
So Brooke, just in terms of how that actually works, do you have your own proprietary LLM? And then if I'm a business, for example, and I want to build something based on your LLM, is it harnessing the data that I have within my organization to do that?
Yes. So we are not building our own model. What our tech is sort of the semantic layer, the APIs and frameworks, the processing side. We're sort of the middleware between the LLM and the application layer. So if you're wanting to use our technology, you're bringing your proprietary data. You don't have to feed it to a model that's going to train on it, and have questions about data leakage, questions about security, just questions about trust, about whether you really want an LLM to know everything about your business, and if you're a media company, your entire archive of content, and being able to then apply that in such a way using our technology that the output is ultimately some kind of application that you can search off of, you can do calculations off of, you can look at research or articles or anything else that kind of points to the underlying data that goes into the system.
Just for our listeners, explain hallucinations, what that means, because we're going to get into inaccuracies and bias.
Right.
But hallucinations may not immediately makes
Right.
sense to our listeners.
Right, totally. So hallucinations are any time that you get what I call sort of confident lying from the LLM. And so LLMs, as I mentioned, large language models, they are the underlying technology that powers all of the AI that you're probably familiar with, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google and others. That technology, like I said, is probabilistic. So it is basically trying to, based on the input that it's received, sort of guessing what is the most appropriate answer to follow. It is guessing that based on what it's seen in its trading set, which in most cases is the open web, some sort of data sources. It has a limit of how much knowledge it has, even when you consider how large the open web is. And so what happens is that occasionally it tries to provide an answer. It wants to please, it wants to give sort of some sort of output that's not really based in logic. You might have seen, news articles that talked recently, or somewhat recently, about how, Google Gemini was telling people to put glue on their pizza, and that was coming from Reddit articles. I recently was preparing for the talk here at Web Summit, and I was asking about Gutenberg's typewriter and when that was developed, or typewriter, wow, movable type, his printing press. There you go, the typewriter is in my head. And it talked about typewriting as a technology innovation, as opposed to what he truly invented. Typewriting came much, much later. And so, if you don't have the context, that answer can seem probable, but ultimately it is, as I said, a confident lie, which adds a lot of confusion and sort of lack of trust towards LLMs and their output.
Someone told me that they asked a LLM how to spell how many R's were in strawberry, and it said 2. There's 3. I did second guess myself for a while.
I had to take
we all looked up. We're like,
Yeah.
How many are there? Yeah. Yes.
So there's also just that inaccuracies, right?
Right.
Yeah, like simple ones as well.
Right. It's especially struggles with anything computational. That is one of its weak points. It's something that I've seen it again and again, and if you ask it to do anything sort of on the mathematical side or working with, counting, which any, kindergarten age child can do, it's amazing how on the one hand, these LMs can feel sort of otherworldly genius, and on the other side feel that they are flubbing very simplistic type questions.
Let's talk a little bit about biases as well,
Yep.
because that's a significant problem that generative AI
Yeah.
has to deal with, because it's developed by
Humans. Yeah. So
how do we solve that?
I think part of it is the recognition that it's not solvable just by assuming that the technology itself is going to fix it. It's not a continuum of, again, similar to the hallucination problem, better models equal better outputs, less bias. The training data that it ingests is what informs that bias, and so the same biases that exist in our own society, that exist in the content that we produce, are going to be reflected in the AI outputs that are ingesting that data and ultimately making decisions on how to respond accordingly. What we need to do is, at least at this stage, until we reach AGI, whenever that comes, or similar levels of high AI intelligence, is to think about guardrails, to think about being very transparent about where data sources are coming from, being very clear about what content we let in and what content we don't. One of the things we're very focused on in Infactory is that we don't want to be scraping the open web. We don't want to be just taking things from Reddit and treating that as the same level that you would treat something that would come from a, highly respected researcher, or medical journal, or financial documentation. Any of those things, that they shouldn't be treated equally. And that's something that the models are working on as well. But a lot of it is the same principles that have informed data science and data engineering for a long time. What you take in is what you get out, and biases are a big part of that.
And so, Brooke, if you just going back to when you were talking about Infactory, if you're sort of sitting in the middle between these LLMs and the sort of enterprise, what LLMs, for example, are being sort of used at this point in time? Is it the big ones, the sort of Chat GPTs and Geminis of this world at this point?
In our solution?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are what I would call LLM agnostic.
Yeah.
So our intent is that we can make our solution work with whatever LLM our customers want to bring. That is intentional for a few reasons. One is because different LLMs have different skill sets. 2 is cost. So certain LLMs are cheaper. They're open source, like from Meta's Llama and others, where if you don't necessarily need to throw the most cutting edge, most expensive, largest model at a problem because you have underlying tech to help support that, there are cost benefits ultimately to the end user. And then I think lastly on the bias side, thinking about what did the model actually ingest, what kind of training data does it have, a lot of that is generally obscured at this stage. We haven't really solved for the problem of explainable AI. That's something that we're very interested in Infactory. I think a lot of people are very interested in exploring. But for that reason, we also want to make it very clear to our end users what models are being used, and as best we can, for people to understand if there are models that are known to be biased in a certain way or work with partners of a certain caliber, that is as clear to the user as possible when deciding whether to trust the LLM itself.
And of course, some of these large language models are based on the open web.
That's
and
right.
information, and we know how much sort of misinformation and disinformation has spread across the web. So if those LLMs are themselves trained on some of this inaccurate data, when it comes to what you do, how do you filter out those inaccuracies that are spewed up from those LLMs? Because that, to me, feels like such a key part of the equation.
Right. I mean, a big part of it for us is having the answer rely, when you're asking a question of the system in Infactory, the answer not coming directly from the LLM itself, but from our technology, which is going to go to a set of verified partners. We are very anti-web scraping, as I said. That is like a completely hard line for us. We do not scrape the open web to get answers that we want. And in cases where it's either a question of, is this a quality source or not a quality source? Is this a bias source or not a bias source? Again, exposing that to the user. So our system makes it very clear where this came from. In cases where there isn't, it's not binary, it's 2 + 2 = 4, but, what is the opinion of this certain expert on this particular topic versus another expert, where there's certainly could be room for debate, that we allow there to be some understanding of where that information came from, what are the opposing viewpoints, and if there is a difference in quality between the viewpoints, that we're also making that very clear on the end user level.
I suppose the question that I find tricky is that biases are one thing, but also a lot of people have their own truth.
That's right.
And that's a slightly different thing, where there's two answers to maybe a question, and the nuance that is clearly lacking in today's world when it comes to news or social media. I mean, that's a horse that's already bolted. How do you rein that in? How do you find your place in that?
Yeah, it's a tough question in my mind. A question that we are going to have to solve for the internet model as it exists today to continue, which I know sounds very hyperbolic, but I think is honestly, when you see what search and social media did to sort of muddling what is truth and what is not, what is biased and what is not, what people trust and choose not to trust, that, to your point, it's sort of the horse is already bolted. That's very hard to pull back. One of the opportunities I think we have with AI partly comes to monetization, because the way that we decided to fund the previous round of the web was through advertising. Advertising relies on an algorithm that relies on clicks and views, which relies on allowing a certain amount of information to get to users regardless of its quality. I think we have this chance with AI to potentially monetize differently, potentially provide revenue sharing opportunities for publishers, for content owners, for data owners, in such a way that you could almost pay for quality, and you could pay for a sense of, are you giving a viewpoint that most people would understand to be reasonable, or of at least based in some sense of fact and accuracy. I'm not saying that this is, great, done and dusted, let's just do revenue sharing and the problem is solved, but it does allow us to finally sort of have a question of, is this the kind of way we want content to be served on the web going forward?
Brooke, we keep talking about trust in AI and guardrails, which is a term that's thrown about a lot.
Yeah.
Share some ideas, or some of your initial ideas, about what trust in AI looks like to you, and actually what guardrails look like. Yeah, I think you alluded to some earlier around transparency of those models. What are the models trained on? What is the data? What is the sources? But how can we go about actually making that transparent?
And just to be clear, guardrails, we're talking about regulation here, or just protections?
I think, ultimately both. I would say that the place that I would speak more confidently from is going to be from the technology side, but I don't necessarily share the viewpoints of every single AI founder that we should just let regulation be solved in the future. This is maybe goes back to even to the beginning of the topic of what qualities do I think the next AI leadership needs to have. I think one of them is recognizing that, again, we missed the boat a bit on regulation in the earlier part of the internet, and I think we paid the price for it. And so recognizing that there will need to be policies that are somehow keeping up with the speed in which technology is changing, the way in which technology is being used in a very different way than it's being used before. But from the side that I can speak to with sort of more ownership about is sort of the technology guardrail side, and that really, in my mind, comes down to data attribution. So can you follow the line of, from I ask a question of 2 + 2 = 4, can you see how it came up with that calculation, show the work? That's something we're big on in Infactory, see where the calculation came from or see how the answer was derived. And then from there, what underlying data did it use to come up with that answer? Because in the case of AI, it's not the human brain. It's not sitting there actually doing the calculation. It's not a calculator. What it is that it's saying, oh, I've seen other addition problems like this before, ergo, I think I can solve it, by combining the numbers in such a way. That's obviously a very simplistic example, but I think that those are the kinds of things that help people feel that they can trace the answer basically backwards, all the way back to its source point. The other side of guardrails, I think, also comes from data quality, not just about the kinds of sources that you allow into the model, but also the ways that businesses and consumers will ultimately decide what kind of data should be available for AI to ingest. Not all proprietary data, I think, belongs in an LLM, I don't think, or belongs in an AI solution. And, maybe it goes all the way back to regulation. Maybe regulation will decide that. But healthcare data, personal, safety data about, people's lineage or backgrounds, is that something that we want to bring in? Right now we're sort of treating it as that more data is better, just ingest everything that you can. I think there has to be a point that you stop somewhere.
So from the transparency perspective first, do you envisage a world where really we should, let's say we use an AI app of some sort,
yeah.
we put a query in, we get the answer, we should be able to, as an end user, be able to see what where that's going. So like the glue on the pizza is a great example, because if that comes up, you may think, maybe there's something here that I've missed.
Right.
And if that source was from a really renowned 3 Michelin star chef, you go, okay, cool, that's good. But if it's from a Reddit thread of weird toppings that people have had on pizza, that's a different proposition.
Completely. And I think there's an argument to be made that there would be other systems that you could argue that just would discount the Reddit source altogether. And I'm not sure that's the right answer either, because there might be some folks who decide, I prefer to get my cooking tips from Reddit. The same way that news people do have different opinions about where those things come from. I don't think that the technology provider should be the arbitrator of who sees what, but I think having some level of exposure to the end user in that regard is going to move the needle significantly on transparency.
Do you think the whole point of these LLMs, right, is that they get an immediate answer, it's quick, it's easy, right? I've got a dissertation, I just want to just double check, I don't want to then have to check the source of this information and go into it and just see where that sort of defeats the purpose. And fake news is prevalent, right? And people don't really care about checking whether it's fake news.
Right.
I suppose it's more of a societal problem than a tech.
Yes, my next startup company is Fix Society.
Quite right.
Yes, but no, it's a fair point. I think it's partly why, as I was talking before about the old model of the internet, is some of that is now fairly entrenched, and will people just bring that same viewpoint of, I don't really care because I don't trust sort of anything, and unless I have been told by a specific source, and that source itself is actually, not particularly trustworthy. I think where our tech makes the most sense is going to have to do with areas where it is less contentious. And so, but moving beyond just the Infactory point of view and just thinking more broadly to how do you fix society, I think one of the things that has not existed in the current internet is that even when you think about search or think about social media, you don't have a great sense, even from those more algorithmic as opposed to LLM-oriented technologies, why am I being surfaced so many videos about this particular polarizing topic in my Instagram feed? Why am I, and when I watch this one YouTube video, the next 10 YouTube videos are on an increasingly darker and more nefarious topic. I think building some of the guardrails in the system in such a way that makes it clear to end users why information is being chosen to be shown to them is certainly a step in the right direction, and something that AI can enable differently.
Brooke, we talked briefly about regulation earlier as well, and this is beyond the valley, so let's look at the international perspective.
Yeah.
Here in the European Union, they've been very quick to regulate and bring in the EU AI Act, which I think is looking at the use cases of AI and the risks associated with certain use of AI. What does ideal regulation look to you? Does it need to sort of come in sort of smaller steps than that, perhaps addressing points that you've raised around things like transparency, for example, or the use of certain data? What, in an ideal world, does it look like to you?
I think in an ideal world, for one, is that from the US perspective, regulation will not move forward without industry embracing it. And so some of that does come from incremental change, because inherently you're going to need the leaders of the tech incumbents and the tech startups and the broader venture community and everyone else to get on board with that the regulations are ultimately in the best interest of the industry itself. But I also think that nothing short of a very tremendous sort of overhaul in updating policies that honestly haven't even caught up with social media and the other trends, they're so far behind, will ensure that these tools are being used in a way that's safe and ultimately beneficial for society at large. This, as I said, this technology has tremendous potential for good, but that comes with also the responsibility of those that could decide how it's used, both from a market's perspective and a government perspective, to actually take some kind of action there, which there has not been a great trend of that in the past, but this is sort of a wave of technology that's breaking all the previous norms, so why not in regulation too?
I said at the top that everyone here at Web Summit is talking about AI, which is surprising, obviously. How do businesses implement AI responsibly? And there's obviously this mad rush to not be left behind.
Right.
Do they need to start implementing AI within their business now, or they start thinking about it, or should they be taking a more considered approach?
I think that I think they can start implementing now, and I don't think that considered approach means that you have to slow down or fall behind in the competition cycle. In fact, I think some of the greater innovations to come from AI that can help businesses actually stay ahead and differentiate are going to come from thinking about using AI more safely, using AI in a context of how do we ensure that if this is the foundation layer and we're basically in sort of inning one, or sorry to use a baseball reference here in Europe, but we're at the very beginning of a very long journey as far as where AI is going to be, and hard to predict the future, that the new leaders, the new opportunities are going to come from the people that I think consider what the long-term consequences are. And so I don't think it's an interchange of, it has to be one for another. If you're going to be careful or measured about how you're using AI, therefore you're going to fall behind in the competition cycle. In fact, I think it can be just the opposite as far as thinking about it in ways that no one else has yet.
Were you going to say innings, Brooke?
I was.
Because, the cricket fans amongst our listeners.
Oh, okay.
Don't get
they'll get it.
Okay,
they'll
great,
get it.
great,
We have
great.
innings in cricket.
Yeah, but yes,
Yeah.
much longer ones, as I understand it. Yes.
In terms of sort of AI, I was having this conversation earlier with the CEO of Unbabble, a European translation company, and he said that actually he believes that in 3 years' time, there won't be need for humans in translation because of the advancements of LLMs, which was obviously a bold call, and there's obviously huge debate that's been raging over the past few years about the impact of technology, and in particular more automation and AI, on jobs across the world. Then you've got the layer about artificial general intelligence, which you sort of mentioned at the top,
Yep.
and how advanced that is, if that does indeed come to pass, and what exactly that looks like. And then you've got sort of big names in technology also warning about the existential threat to humanity from AI. So there's a lot to
Yeah.
also be concerned, potentially pessimistic about as well on some of these debates. And we can start with perhaps the job side of the equation. Where do you sit in that debate?
I sit very much on the side of optimistic, in that I think that by the time AI has reached the level of maturity of, if not AGI, something that has truly transformed work as we understand it, I think that will also mean, though, that what defines work, what capitalism looks like, what all these sort of structures are going to have so fundamentally changed. And I guess I have faith in sort of humanity's ability to adjust for that. We've gone through multiple, history major coming back here, we've gone through multiple revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, the Web Revolution, and each time people have assumed that, while there has been an extreme disruption at those periods of times, a lot of people have assumed that this would be the end of sort of work as we understand it. And instead, there's been an evolution, and that, what a job is, the idea of being a knowledge worker that you are today, even in, a few decades ago would have seemed very strange that we spend all of our time in front of a computer, we don't go into an office, that, there are people that don't work for a large corporation but are, in more of a consultant type business, all of these other changes that are much more incremental. I guess I believe in sort of the parallels of what the nature of work looks like, following very closely in line with what the AI technology will actually become.
And the existential threats to humanity, just posturing at this point?
Yeah, I don't. It's possible that there are some folks over at, the large tech companies that have knowledge that I do not have about how close we are to our impending doom. I won't discount that. But I also think we are much, much further from AGI than people realize. And as a result, we have a lot more time to prepare to ensure that humanity is set up for a successful future as a result of AI, not the opposite.
I wanted to just sort of, I think, this last part, talk a bit about your journey as an entrepreneur as well. And as you've worked at the largest of the large tech companies, you've also worked in new startups, including here at Infactory. What have been some of the differences between working at sort of a big company like Google, for example,
right,
and then now kind of heading up a young startup?
Yeah, to me, the biggest difference is on the impact side. And because both are impactful, right? At Google, I had the opportunity to work on devices and Android, which is the most popular operating system in the world, and things that I worked on and projects that I worked on were ultimately filtered down into products that were used by billions of users. So the impact is very measurable and it's very obvious, and that was tremendous to be able to have that kind of influence on where technology was going. Impact in the startup space has its own sort of scale, which also can feel sort of larger than life, and that you're sort of building something out of nothing. That 0 to 1 feeling of where there was sort of just ideas and possibility, and in our case, a drawing on a whiteboard, there's now a company, and there's now a technology, and ideally something that, however it goes, will have an impact on people's lives that was simply not there prior to us deciding to prioritize it. And so, it's, to me, a very energizing kind of impact to be able to do that.
Can we talk a little bit about the bro code that you call it of AI business?
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of these AI companies are male-led. Obviously, we've already mentioned about the human element to creating large language models, and just generally how the focus has been quite sort of science research based.
Yeah.
Rather than the use case of like how we can best use AI. How do we change that? How do we bring the likes of yourself and more female leaders into AI to balance out the gender equality situation?
I think a few things. I think one is that to date, a lot of the interest and attention in AI has been on the research side, which, to be very clear, has many prominent female scientist researchers. So this is not to say that it is remotely fair that most of that attention has been male, but it largely has been. That is shifting, I think, as people recognize that the models are sort of not plateauing, but they are sort of reaching a point where it's not where the most exciting innovations are coming from, and that now everyone's asking about applied AI. I think about agents, so much about the agentic framework is about jobs and tasks that are often industries that women have very sizable roles in, customer service and HR, yeah, back of house management, all of, hospitality and travel. There's many categories in which I would hope that women's voices are valued, because if we are ever going to understand what AI can do from an enterprise perspective, what it can do as far as I said, for good and for sort of the optimistic outlook, you're going to want to have participation from the people whose current jobs and activities are most influenced by that. And so, to me, that shift is happening, and I think it will continue to happen. And I think also, I think not rewarding the bad behavior. Largely, I talk a lot about sort of our policy against scraping. That has sort of been swept under the rug largely. People have sort of accepted that as sort of par for the course, and it, to me, feels like a little bit of a regression to some of the earlier viewpoints people had, like the Uber era of, just ignore regulation, ignore policy, ignore rules for the sake of innovation, and it doesn't have to be that way. There are other methods we could go about, and that to me has very much the taste of the bro code in it if we're going to go back down that route.
Can we talk a little bit about Humane? I remember it was, I don't know how long ago, but Arjun tried out the pin.
It was at Mobile World
It was
Congress,
Mobile
wasn't
World
it,
Congress.
this year?
Oh.
Yeah, I had a chance to check it out.
I was
actually,
probably there with you,
Yeah.
so great.
And I have to say, I wasn't there and I didn't see it in person, but
you
I was
saw
in
the video.
office. I saw the video,
Yeah.
and we were all gobsmacked, and we were super excited about
Yeah.
it. Across the board, it was like, wow, that is really cutting edge. But it didn't necessarily pan out like that. How was that journey for you? I mean, it was your first foray into a sort of startup, and obviously didn't work out the way you would want. What are your reflections on it?
I think, first of all, to hear the reaction, it is true that when you see the AI pin in action, it is an incredible piece of technology, and such courage and sort of audacity to build a product like that outside of a large tech incumbent is very exciting, and I hope we continue to see more projects like that, because just like we need more interesting applications for AI, just as we need more people jumping in to participate in this innovation cycle, I think we need more people looking at the hardware question and figuring out what comes next, or we're just going to get iterative versions of our iPhones from now until the end of eternity. And so I'm excited to see more energy around that, and doing hardware is really hard. It is not for the faint of heart. Doing hardware at a startup is sort of like doing it with both hands tied behind your back. I feel nothing but goodwill towards the founders of Humane, and in particular Bethany Bongiorno, who I honestly credit to my desire to want to jump into the startup waters. It's also where, as I mentioned, I met my co-founder, so grateful for that experience as well. But the people and the influence that I had there, as far as getting the sense of, I also want to be, having an influence on this ecosystem going forward.
Just a final one from me, I think sort of a bigger thought. Again, just because we're talking beyond the valley, when we've spoken a lot about what's happening in AI and who's dominating at this point in time, a lot of it we're talking about the big so-called hyperscalers and these large US-based organizations. Does the sort of rise of these LLMs, does the developments happening in AI give a chance at this point for this market to be shaken up, for the incumbents in technology to have some real challenges, which they perhaps haven't had for a while?
100%. As I said, I've been in the industry longer than I care to admit, and it's never felt more salient that there is an opportunity for new players to emerge, which doesn't necessarily mean that the old guard is going away. I think the old guard will change. As a Google alum, I harbor goodwill for that company and what it can accomplish and the brilliant people that work there, and certainly the things that they have done to get AI to the point that it is now. But across the board, given that we're on Beyond the Valley, I think there's also never been a better time for technology to come from places outside of Silicon Valley, and for there sort of being a democratic layer here of, with agents being something that sort of smaller, leaner companies can build. It doesn't just have to come from the foundational model side. That was what was needed to kind of get to the stage that we are today, to inning one, as we will say to the cricket and our first inning to the cricket and baseball fans. But now I feel like we're in the age of it's anybody's game and the field's wide open.
Fantastic stuff. Brooke, that's all we have time for, but we're going to finish off by playing Stat of the Week.
Okay.
So the stat I gave at the start was 94% of people in the UK have.
94.
94%.
So as the guest, you can decide to go first or second.
I'll be bold. I'll go first. So I do think it's funny we're doing a stat and we've been talking about hallucinations, where I'm like, is this a trick question? Is this going to be a made-up stat? I'll say use ChatGPT.
Tom?
have concerns that AI will take their jobs?
Yeah, but I mean, both very good guesses, but not the answer I was looking for. So 94% people in the UK have reported witnessing misinformation on social media. This is according to a study by the Alan Turing Institute. But the reason I picked that is because I think it underscores a lot of what we've been talking about here, about the training of these models, some of the information they're trained on, the sources, etc. And it speaks to, I think, what you're trying to solve at Infactory as well. So that's it. Quite shocking, isn't it?
That is high, but
Yeah.
but also not entirely surprising.
Not entirely,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, you just need to open sort of any social media app
Right.
at this point in time,
Right.
and you'll come across something
So
where
it also begs the question of who's deciding it's misinformation. So
also good.
yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. But lovely positive note to finish on.
Yeah, I love the
After all the
optimism.
AI optimism, we took it in
Yeah.
a different direction. It's fine.
Brought it back down.
Well, Brooke, it was great to have you,
Thank you.
on the show. That's it for this episode. Before we go, please follow and subscribe to the show, and you can even leave us a review. And if you want to contact Arjun and I, or have a question about this episode or a past episode, then email us at beyondthevalley@cnbc.com. Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arjun.
Thank you, Tom.
We'll be back next week for another episode of Beyond the Valley. Goodbye.
Beyond the Valley.